My guest today is Warren Smith, a Massachusetts teacher whose Secret Scholars YouTube channel has become a wildly popular source for cultural and political discourse. We discuss the currents that exist beneath our culture war, the difference between wisdom and intelligence, and how DEI has disrupted the art of filmmaking. Warren is an adventurer in the realm of critical thinking and effortlessly illuminates the important notes in difficult subjects. This is a great conversation with a unique and talented thinker. Stay tuned. Warren, thanks for talking to me today, man. I've been watching all of your videos. I'm a bit addicted to your channel. Every time my wife looks at my phone, she's like, "That guy again? What are you doing? What's going on with this guy?" But man, I just think what you're doing is so important. You're bringing so much to the ongoing cultural conversation, and I'm just really glad we have this opportunity to talk, man. Thank you.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on why you like it and why you think it's effective as well, because that's very helpful for me.
Yeah, well, so I guess I recognized what was happening culturally in the West about 14 years ago, around 2010, was where I figured out what was going on. And the reason why I did is because I've spent most of my life reading history. So I was seeing a lot of what has happened in the past start to kind of get piped into us into the West culturally. And by that I mean like the Cultural Revolution in China. I saw a lot of what they did, 50, 60 years ago, I guess 80 years ago now, uh, kind of coming back to the surface here in the West. And it was confusing to me because we'd always been culturally, I guess, opposite from, say, for example, Marxist tenets, right? Like we had
Yeah.
largely rejected a lot of what Marxism had to offer for a really long time. And I've spoken to different people because I'm 40 years old, so I'm a millennial. I didn't realize that this was actually kind of coming into uh, surfacing in Western culture as early as the 60s and the 70s, because of course I wasn't around then. I just saw it really kind of take hold in 2010. And now here we are 14 years later, and it's like I always kind of I always kind of equate it to two people screaming at each other through a brick wall. And that's where we are. We now have two competing ideologies. One that was a predetermined, preformed ideology, and then one that formed in response to the first ideology. And now if you go online, for example, it's an argument that's not really an argument. It's just two groups shouting over top of each other. And what you're doing is you're coming right down the middle, cutting through the noise and attacking these issues and these subjects with critical thought, which I mean is the most basic way to pick it apart. But it's something that people rarely take the time to stop and actually do. And I think that's why the videos that you're making, the conversations that you're having is resonating with so many people, because we're all seeing you do this so simplistically from a very philosophical viewpoint, right? You're not taking one side or the other. You're just asking why, and you're breaking it all down. You did a recent video where you were talking about Don Lemon's conversation with Elon Musk about the dangers of DEI as it applies to medicine, and you kind of broke down like, hey, if only 5% of this group makes up the total, in order to turn that into 20%, then you have to change the standards no matter what. And you break it down in such a simple way, but a way that's very revealing to a lot of people. So what motivated you to jump into the conversation and kind of present your viewpoint?
Well, I've always had thoughts on the world, and like you were saying, I'm 36, so I think we've had came about a similar time period. So I noticed patterns, and I've had concerns, but I've never had a platform really or a reason to really engage in the conversation. So there was always, I mean, I would if I had a reason, but there was never really a reason. There was never really an opportunity to make a difference. We could put it that way. And then when an opportunity does come along where just completely coincidental, really. I mean, it was just, I would call it luck, and that video goes viral, and that suddenly I'm faced with, okay, what do I do next? And this just, I'm in a position now where I try and just think about what is important, what's genuinely important to me, what do I care about? If there's something that I feel like I have something to say about, so the Don Lemon interview, there was a glaring pattern there that seems very clear to me, and I figured I always assume that it's very obvious, but I've since making these videos, I feel like I've through the comments of things, some people seem to be enjoying it, and I'm thinking, oh, maybe it's not as obvious as I thought. Maybe it's we feel it, we know it, we just don't quite know how to articulate it sometimes. And then sometimes when
That's right.
someone does articulate it, it's like, oh, well, I knew that already, but it's really cool to hear it put into words, because now I know what I was thinking. I just wasn't quite sure how to say it in a way. And the technique, I guess you could say, is really kind of cutting through the noise. And I've been trying to think about how to articulate it. And I would describe it as if you just imagine there's boats sailing on the surface of the water, and words are the boats. So words are just tools that we're using. They're not the end all be all. They're just the darts that we're throwing at the board, trying to hit the bullseye. We're trying to communicate deeper truths, deeper patterns. We're trying to use those words to articulate these deeper patterns, which are all beneath the surface of the water. So you've just got the boats floating, and then the currents, the tides, the unknown depths beneath the surface that we really still don't understand a lot of it. And that's the interesting stuff. So often when you see people debating, they're just engaging with the boats, right? And they'll throw a bunch of boats out there to try and make it so that you have to contend with all those boats, and it makes it impossible to do anything else. Well, if you just ignore that, figure out what matters to you, what's your reason going into it, and then focus on that and understand when to push the boats aside and just realize, okay, and just hone in on those, on the current, whether it's DEI, Don Lemon, and you're responding to that, and you're realizing, oh, there's an actual pattern here and when you're watching Elon in that interview, that's where I was feeling that a bit. I was like, just stick to the current, stick to that pattern deep below. And he was a kind of engaging, he would get defensive. Obviously, I mean, he's got a lot going on, and, that was like in the middle of his workday probably. And, it's harder to do right on the spot as well. So I'm not trying to play backseat driver or anything, but I thought he did a fine job still, but it was just frustrating. Some of those questions, it feels like it's logic allows, it's frustrating when he's like, oh, where's the evidence for this? But that's the whole point of logic, that it allows us to follow these patterns into the future and see how it would have to occur so that we can avert making the wrong decision before we hit catastrophe. So even if it has not happened yet, we can see how it would happen, and to say, well, where's your evidence that it is happening? Okay, let's say it's not happening, Don. Let's just give you that. What's to say that it won't happen like this? That's the real conversation here. And that's what I mean by sorting through the boat. Like, that's the important spot to go.
Yeah, I mean, it's equivalent to, if you own a vehicle and you don't get the oil changed for 3 years, right? Well, what's the evidence that your car is going to break down? It's running fine, it starts up, it gets you to and from. Well, eventually that car is going to die, right? And I had the same frustration in watching that clip, because what you're watching in real time is ideology versus rationality play out, right? That this is a conversation that is almost impossible to have, because Don Lemon is, and the strange thing about it is I don't even think he's authentically an ideologue. I think what he's doing is he's representing an ideology, a team that he believes that will benefit him financially or in other ways. And so, and this is something that you see quite frequently. And this is, I think, what's so striking about what you do, is that it's all disingenuous. It's all inauthentic, right? There's very few people who actually subscribe to the ideology that Don Lemon is representing in that conversation, who actually wholeheartedly believe in what they're saying and doing. And this is why it's difficult to get those people into conversation or to get those people into a debate, because they know that their subjective truth, which I put in quotes because I think truth is a very sketchy thing to deal with when you get down to the brass tacks of it. What is truth? What does truth mean? Right? So their subjective reality, when put up against the objective reality that all of us experience, it crumbles immediately. And that's why they won't have, I on this podcast, I have attempted to have conversations, a number of these conversations with some of these people, and they won't do it. And I'm a lot like you. Like, I'm not intentionally trying to challenge anything to make somebody feel bad or to destroy them, as, you know, to use internet terms, right? Really what I'm trying to do is just have illuminating conversations with people, right? And myself personally, I dislike all ideologies for a number of reasons, but I kind of encapsulate it in saying, you know, ideology presents easy answers to difficult questions for people who don't want to think, right? And I think you're kind of proving that with the videos and the content that you make, is that you're dismantling it all just by simply asking very, very basic questions, right? And so, yeah, I guess the next question I wanted to ask you is these patterns, these undercurrents, like, what did you recognize, and why do you think we focus more on the boats than on the currents underneath?
That's a good question. Well, we know this postmodern way of thinking, we can call it. You were referring to Marxism before, and it's all in this new. I started noticing it in grad school 2016 when I was a grad student getting my MFA, and being the textbooks we were reading, and around, you know, I was studying visual media art and everything, but it was still heavy in the philosophical aspects of it. You know, the medium is the message, and there were literally chapters written from a Marxist perspective, and they weren't even hiding that, you know. And then, and a lot of that thinking comes from the idea that so to contend with what the idea of the boats versus the currents, the tact is to say that everything is a social construct. So therefore, there are no currents beneath the surface. There are no objective, logical patterns which we can recognize, because it is all malleable and it is all subjective in a social construct. That's very handy, and that allows them to evade an argument of logic. That's how they seem to contend with it, and it's how we've seen it through history. So it is a pattern itself. Now, why do they seem to, well, Don Lemon, I mean, I think he was coming from a place, and that's why I think Elon got so frustrated with it, because it was, like you said, it felt motivated from an agenda, whether it was to try and make headlines, to try and do something that would go viral so it could go to The View or whatnot, you know, who knows? Or I find it, perhaps he really was that blind to see that he was just throwing away an opportunity, you know. But probably more likely, he genuinely did not care about, he probably lacks the wisdom to see any value in X, which seems to be something that is shared by what is it, Jonathan Packman, the guy I responded to. Is it Jonathan?
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a common sentiment where they all seem to say, well, there's no value on X, it's a cesspool. So they just write that off, right? So they just seem to be able to, and both sides can do this. It's not just one side, but people just writing things off completely because there's a flaw within the system. They say, we'll throw it out, whether it's capitalism. Well, it's flawed, therefore we should throw it out and reinvent the entire thing. So it's not, so Packman, he was still trying to use patterns, you know. It's just, I think there was just flaws in his logic. So it's going to vary. I wish I had a better answer on that. It's going to vary depending on the person's motivation. Like, he's trying to use those undercurrents, though. I just think that it's more trying to, when you put your point, when you're trying to win the argument, first and foremost, that's when you start to twist logic and you start to miss the currents. where if we can separate, if you don't engage with the person, but rather the idea. So if I can take it, I'm not trying to destroy you or win and I think that comes from a place where growing up, or not growing up, but just since 2016, my friends and family disagreed. And so if the people I love, like my mom, for example, if she disagrees and I'm trying to discuss something, it's in an effort to try and help her see something I think is worth seeing, trying
Mhm.
to almost attain some wisdom that I think is possibly there, not my wisdom, but seeing something differently. It's not about beating her or destroying, it's helping her find truth. And it's more of like, this is what I think is the best route forward. Can you offer anything better? And that is very different than change my mind or trying to just debate for tit for tat, though that will have its place. But, that's, yeah, I've never been in a position yet where I have to try and just score points, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's where we run afoul, is in the point scoring uh, approach, right? Because you're not accomplishing anything in that respect, and that's why I myself won't engage in that sort of stuff, because I think I'm like most people. I've had a very hard time articulating what I see, right? Because it's you go down these these rabbit holes, right? And then you kind of got to like explain, okay, well, this is where this comes from, this is where this comes from. And the postmodern aspect of it is the hardest part to unravel, right? Because it's a lot of gobbledygook, right? And it really, what it boils down to is subjective reality taking precedent, or being the only reality, right? And you know when you read Mao Zedong's writing, right, like probably the earliest seed of postmodern thought that I've found is in Mao's personal diaries in 1923, where he talks about the suffering and the brutality inflicted against others. This was in the very early stages of the communist wave in China, to how it doesn't affect him because his subjective reality is the only reality. Therefore, he's able to carry out all these brutal acts against peasants, people who are poor and starving, because it's not part of his subjective truth, for example, right? Now, I'm sure postmodernism extends, prior to that, but I haven't found anything that early. And postmodernism is so hard to pick apart and dissect, because it's a lot like Marxism in that it's purposely subversive and elusive to grasp, right? And so, for example, yourself, you're reading through this textbook as an undergrad, and you're finding entire chapters that are written from a Marxist perspective. And so how do you articulate that? How do you explain to others, hey, look, this thing is ideological in nature, and this is the ideology that it stems from, right? And it's so hard to pick apart, and I think that's why the argument or the discussion is almost impossible to partake in. It's like talking to a Christian about the nature of God, right? They're kind of locked in a box, an ideological box that doesn't allow them to see outside of that or explore beyond the boundaries, because the laws and the tenets of their dogma doesn't allow them to. So you can't really have the discussion because you're speaking two different languages, right? And so with the DEI thing, we're seeing it. We're seeing real world impacts occur in real time. But the moment you point to them, again, you're pointing towards something that is dogmatic or ideological in nature. So when you point out the problem, and you're saying, look, we have to this solution is creating an infinite number of problems around it that are going to create more problems, and our entire society and civilization are going to spiral out of control. And they say, why? Well, what you're trying to point at is the undercurrent, and the undercurrent is the hard part to really grasp, because it is in itself naturally elusive. I don't know. Am I talking in circles here, or is what I'm saying
No,
making sense?
no, I get what you mean. I think honing in those scenarios, if you can just get, like we were saying, get specific on the key is being specific. So
Hmm.
whether it's the J.K. Rowling conversation, it's because the moment you say, okay, let's get specific though, why? What are you basing that on?
Hmm.
So so with the DEI conversation, it's not just taking it saying that this has infinite potential to cause more issues, but just get specific and show that, look, if you're trying to achieve what you're setting out to achieve, this is the only way for it to unfold, and that's very specific. And then you try and illustrate that in a way that shows that this is based on logic and it's not actually an opinion. And then I open
Hmm.
that up to you. Can you point? Am I wrong about this? And then it becomes a conversation. So it's. I mean, well, when I was talking about those textbooks things, I didn't even really know what I was looking at. That was 2016. I didn't quite have the vocabulary, or I
Yeah.
wasn't. I could feel something was strange about it, just the environment as well, because I was in grad school and there were several classes where I'm not even exaggerating. I was the only American student. The rest were from China, were Chinese students, and I have nothing against Chinese people, but it was very. I found myself thinking, why is the graduate school 80% Chinese students? It's very
Yeah.
undergrad wasn't. So wow. And then they had student ambassadors travel to China to do marketing there, and I just thought it was really interesting. I was like, well, okay, well clearly there's a business reason for this, and I tried to look into it, and I tried to do a little documentary about it. And the moment you start questioning things, you start seeing pushback, and that's when it was encounters like that where I saw the moment you start asking the wrong questions, you get ostracized or pushed back upon. That same class I was talking about, we were having a discussion around the philosophy of the internet and whether the internet can be controlled by the government. And I was saying, well, I'm not sure that that would be feasible in the long term. And there were about, a few other Americans in the class in this particular class, but there was about 7 to 8 Chinese students that lived in China and were just here for grad school. And I said, well, let's ask you guys, like, you've been living with it. How is it working out in China? What's your perspective on this? Do you think it's feasible? Because you've experienced that. They shut they said, whoa, 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 you can't do that. We can't talk. I was thinking, that seems like a valid question. Is that we're in the academy? This is the whole point of this class we're having discussion, but the moment this discussion veers into simply asking for that perspective, that's a no-no. And they literally shut that conversation down. Those are the early days. And it was moments like that. And then there was other things that were even more glaring than that. But I wasn't armed with the vocabulary to even comprehend I didn't know what Marxism was.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
that's
I don't. Yeah. I don't think most people are, and I think that's. I think there's something. You did a video where you talked about Destiny's review of the movie Sound of Freedom, and I wrote a little piece of that on X because I thought it was
oh
such a
yeah,
beautiful. It was
yeah.
such a
And I
beautiful.
forget that wasn't his review. What was his? Most of that review was not Destiny. Actually, it was the other YouTuber in that video, who I can't even remember his name. So
I
I
don't
don't
know.
want
I
to.
don't. Yeah.
I should clarify that though, that was not Destiny in the later part of it. It was. I did one clip of Destiny, and I don't think he was talking about Son of Freedom. He was responding to. Oh, he was responding to the Republican response of the State of the Union, and that
Okay.
tied into the border conversation. And I was addressing that part, and then we looked at another YouTuber, his response to. So I just wanted to clarify that wasn't actually
Yeah.
Destiny's comments on Sound of Freedom. But
Okay. Well, regardless, I mean, you did a video kind of breaking down the way that this person was reacting to this film, and I think the film is a good proxy for like what's happening to us culturally, right? Because the film is not, it doesn't lean ideologically either way, right? It's a true story about a guy who sacrificed his career to save children from a sex trafficking ring. The real story is far more complicated than what was on film. But naturally, of course, the Christian right, once the film was released, because the movie was produced by a Christian studio, the Christian right kind of identified with the movie. And then in response to that, the left, which includes mainstream media, kind of dogged the movie and tagged it as being like this alt-right, MAGA film. And it's weird because this movie that really doesn't have any political element to it is suddenly politicized. And you talked about, which I thought was very important, you talked about whether the person who was reviewing the film or reacting to the film was smart but not wise. And I thought, this is brilliant, because this is a conversation we very rarely have. So in your view, what's the difference between intelligence and wisdom?
Yeah, well, let's think about Destiny, for example. Jordan Peterson just published his, I would call it a debate with Destiny.
Yeah.
So just coincidentally, that just came out like 3 days ago.
Yeah.
And I think it shows that point very well. He's able to speak quickly, articulate himself, he's able to find facts, remember facts and statistics, though he's not able to navigate those facts necessarily. He doesn't extrapolate from those facts, though. This is a subjective thing for me to say. He's not extrapolating wisdom, but what you do with the facts is another thing. For being able to understand facts and think quickly, that's different than wisdom. There is intelligence. Right. There's a lot of intelligent people I know that are extremely smart and strong, though they, for whatever reason, I would disagree with them on larger topics that I think would fall more under that category of wisdom, of how to navigate the long term, how to recognize when you are so fastened to a presupposition. When you're trying to, this is one of the things that Destiny does, is and he's admitted to this himself, which I give him credit for. When he gets in that mode, he says, I will, if I'm attached to something, or if I'm feeling defensive, or I will argue that 2 + 2 = 5, and I won't give any ground away. And he knows he will just die on that hill. And at least he's able to acknowledge that, but that's something that you will often encounter. And intelligence is not going to really help you. There's something else, being able to pull back from that, recognize when you yourself are doing that. Because, I mean, Socrates made it famous, the idea that wisdom really comes from recognizing that how little we actually know, and being open to learning more, and that pursuit itself, that pursuit that is about more than just winning. So yeah, it would be something like that. It's a larger conversation, the line between wisdom and intelligence. But
yeah, it really is.
It'd be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would see. This is what I struggle with. I struggle with exactly what you just outlined. There are a lot of people who can rattle off facts and data points but they're unable to extrapolate the wisdom from it. And I see that a lot, again, in this tit for tat, got to destroy this other person. But I guess if you want to use the analogy of boats, it's like battleship, right? And that's really what we're seeing, is that you have all of these ships on the surface shooting at each other. Meanwhile, the current underneath stays the same. Nothing changes, right? So everybody's trying to sink each other's battleship, but the current continues.
And it's going beyond just the other person. I think it's also about being able to make the difficult decision. So I'm a big student of World War II and Churchill.
Me too.
So if we were to look at Churchill in the early days, before America got involved in the war, and everyone around him wants to negotiate, wants to make concessions because they see no way out. Now, you could make the argument that is the intelligent strategy on the surface, and most were saying you are being stubborn and unintelligent, but I would say he was actually coming from a place of a deeper wisdom, knowing that you cannot negotiate with tyrants, even though if that might lead to our very demise, but it will lead to the long term, our nation being able to rise again. You could make the argument that, well, that's going to lead to our demise. That's not an intelligent course of action. So perhaps sometimes this is a deeper conversation, but perhaps sometimes the wise decision will be judged by many as the unintelligent one. So there is something interesting there. There's a difference in being able to what is the thing that motivated him to be able to stand alone and do that, and when everyone else around you is telling you something else. I mean, it's just such a remarkable time in history that I think there a lot can be learned from that. And so I try and use that as an analogy for it can be used as an analogy for a lot of things regarding critical thinking. That line in the sand that we, whether it's okay, everyone should be treated equal regardless of gender and race. How about we'll just take race? Our approach to racism is changing so much, and the reasons why we can get to, but I think it's all coming from the same place. We all know that we want a better world. We all, on the surface, we don't want racism. We disagree on how to get there. And so the other side, being able to recognize the nobility of their intentions, you get with, but the wisdom element comes in, and now they're crossing a line in the sand in the same way that Churchill was like, we cannot cross this line no matter what, because we know what in the history has shown us, studying ancient philosophers and deriving wisdom from the past. We cannot make an exception. This is our first principle. We will not treat people differently based upon the color of their skin. Oh, but we want equity, and so these people need to be treated differently. Sorry, no, we don't cross that line. Even though I know
That's
it
right.
feels good, even though I know you think you're doing it for the right reason, in the same way they're saying, look, you need to go negotiate with him so that we don't die. There's something there about understanding what your lines are. And so I've been trying to write this out, like the method for critical thinking. And it keeps coming back to the reason. Like, why are you even having the conversation to begin with? Why are you picking that battle? Why are you even talking about that with that person? If you don't have the reason, I don't know, you're not gonna, it's not going to go well, first of all, because you don't know what you're trying to do, or you don't know what you're getting out of it. So understanding why is something I keep coming back to. But that was a long-winded response.
No, that was beautiful. You picked up on two things there that I want to touch, because first, okay, World War II, right? And this is a beautiful intelligence versus wisdom sort of scenario, right? And before people listening to this go crazy, let me finish what I'm going to say, and I'll let Warren comment before I move forward. So Hitler invades Austria, right? Hitler invades Czechoslovakia. The United States, Britain, France, they're all really trepidatious about challenging Hitler in any way, because they had just concluded the First World War. They don't want to go through that again. First World War is probably the most brutal war in modern history, right? So Hitler in his movements is actually wise, because he's reading the room, and he knows that these people, Chamberlain, France, even Russia, are not going to challenge him, right? As long as he just keeps taking these baby steps. And in fact, the only person he's really truly worried about during the Anschluss, when he rolls into Austria, is Mussolini. So what does he do? Is he sends a cable to Mussolini to kind of feel the room. Mussolini says, whatever, do what you want, right? So Hitler, as crazy and as much of a madman as he is during this period, and let's say the Third Reich ends in 1938, something happens, and the Holocaust never occurs, would you classify Hitler as wise in doing what he did?
I think be making a strategic move, recognizing a strategic opening, because it goes back to the reason, like we were saying, why are you even making that move to begin with? So I think the ability to recognize a strategic opening doesn't constitute wisdom necessarily. I think he might have been making an effective strategic move to accomplish his goal. That doesn't mean that his goal was wise, because that goes right back to what we were just saying about the importance of the reason. Because the move itself doesn't matter unless the reason is coming from a place of wisdom. And I think we can all recognize that his wasn't coming from a place of wisdom when you look at it like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? Yeah, no, that's a good answer. Yeah, because I've always been fascinated by his motivations, right? Because he kind of caught everybody off guard, right? He gives all of these pro peace speeches. You know, he's on the cover of Time magazine, Man of the Year, and then all of a sudden he rolls in Austria. Then he rolls like, you know, like it's kind of like he almost. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's like he just knew how to play the world. He knew how to play everybody, and he knew where people's thresholds were. And even if he didn't, he would test the water and then accurately sum up what his adversaries, how they were going to react or respond, right? And he's, again, I'm not a fan of Hitler in any way. I think dying in a bunker with a bullet in his head was the best possible thing for the world and the best way for a guy like that to die, after realizing that his entire batshit crazy Aryan master race ideology was completely wrong. You know, that's the beautiful thing about his story arc, right? Is that he realizes in the end that he was completely wrong, and that he was, I mean, I don't even know if he ever actually authentically believed in the things that he was saying, but
That's it. You should watch that Jordan Peterson interview with Destiny. He talks about this with Destiny, and at one point he says this way more eloquently than I can. But he says, yes, he ended up dying in a bunker, committing suicide with the woman he just married the day before. But what
right.
could we say? Perhaps that in the beginning, that was the end. He was deep down on some level that he actually was planning for or wanted on some degree, to some degree. So human motivation is it's a very strange, complex thing, right? So when you're talking about his ability to, the scary thing is that he was able to tap into that zeitgeist, and that zeitgeist lives within all of us in every country. There's nothing genetically different about the people in Germany then or now or here, right? We're made of the same stuff. We're made of the same fallibility. Like we have the same potential. So I did one little video about that, a thought experiment, and that's nothing original, that thought experiment where, you know, if you ask yourself genuinely, what could you have had the capacity to, had you been born at that time in that place, surrounded by that propaganda, could you have been a guard at Auschwitz? Like, and then most people are just saying no, they could never have done it. And those are the kind of people. That's another sign of intelligence versus wisdom, because I think it takes a certain wisdom to recognize the horror, with the potential horror within us all, and the importance of taking responsibility to avoid that and recognize that you make the wrong moves, you could go down a dark path. You have the capacity to do that. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note too, that during that time, you know, Germany was in a state of turmoil, obviously, due to the Versailles Treaty, due to the Weimar Republic. They were, I mean, everything. It was extremely turbulent. And Hitler, when he came in, turned around the economy pretty quickly. So there's an additional factor there, right? When you're starving, and then your new leader arrives and brings jobs and food, puts food on the table.
Population shortage as well. So you had the economy after the war, but so many men died. They had a population crisis where the population was dying out. So that gives him the platform, the perfect timing for that strategy, just to grab hold.
And so absolutely. But we've seen and I think it's even more reflective of the German population's ability to see what was right and what was ethically and morally correct versus incorrect in that final election, right? Because the Nazis, although I can't remember how many millions of votes they banked, they never won a majority, right? They were never able to win a majority government. And in fact, Hitler was only made chancellor because Hindenburg was tired of the constant elections, and he was trying to encourage Hitler to enter into a coalition government. And that was kind of the way Hitler got into power, right? Was because he guaranteed that he would, and then turned around and, well, after the Reichstag fire, basically created a completely authoritarian atmosphere. And so, I think people, and I think in a lot of ways, some people are right in saying that, what we experienced during the pandemic wasn't anything like Nazi Germany. But I think ethically, there are a lot of common threads between what we endured and what occurred during that period in Germany, right? And
Like
in
what?
that, well, I think with the vaccine mandates, I think if you had have asked people prior to 2020 or to 2021 that if, I guess it depends on the way you word it, but that if it was okay to exclude people from public life because they refused to accept, and just for, just to kind of make the wording easier, I'll refrain from saying a medical experiment, but let's say a vaccine, if it was, if that's how we classify it, that I think most people would say, well, no, or what are the circumstances? They would want more details around it, right? And the thing that really caught me off guard was not early on in the mandates, because I understood that there was a lot of fear over what COVID was, over, there was a lot of propaganda that was circulating, mainstream society and from the media. But I think once we got a clear understanding that, hey, these COVID vaccines don't stop you from transmitting the virus, they don't stop you from getting sick. Like, we saw that sliding scale, right? In the beginning, it was like, you get the vaccine, you'll never get the virus, you can't transmit it to others, safe and effective. And then slowly it started to change. It was, well, you can still give it to people, but you're not going to get sick. And then it was, well, you can still give it to people and you will get sick, but you're not going to die. And you know what I mean? And as that sliding scale was occurring, we didn't see a change in the attitude toward people who refused to take the vaccine. In fact, it was almost like the animosity got worse, because there was pressure on those people who weren't taking the vaccine to take it so that we could all get back to regular life, right? And I guess that's what I mean by that.
I think it'd be more comparable to things today. I mean, like China, for example. I think that'd be a more accurate comparison, where you just the greater good, medical actions for the greater good, and state imposition and everything. But I mean, I'm not a specialist around. I'm not really qualified to talk about the vaccines or anything, but I think that'd be more.
Yeah, of course.
If I were to compare it, I'd probably compare it more to something like that. But
yeah, really yeah, no, for sure, it's no better. But it was like, it caught me off guard, because it was really revealing how many people were willing to compromise themselves and what they knew to be more morally or ethically correct in the face of, well, if we just stop doing this, the state will leave us alone. The state will let us live again. And that was the part that really caught me off guard, was that, well, you're basically admitting to the fact that you are currently under you're being held hostage by the state, and you're being told that if the other hostages will just do what they're told, that they'll let you go, and that was kind of I guess the part that I found to kind of have like some commonality there, because it was like, I remember here in Canada, the Toronto Star, which is a big newspaper out of Toronto, they ran a headline that basically said, like, is it time for us to just stop caring about the people who won't get vaccinated? Is it time, you know what I mean? And it was like, or I can't remember the wording exactly, but it was basically alluding to, like, is it time for us to just take these people out of society altogether?
Yeah.
And I was just floored by it, because I was thinking, how far have we fallen that we've come to this point where we're like, is it time for us to just remove human beings from society because they hold a differing viewpoint?
Yeah, I'd agree. That's crazy. I
Yeah.
know things got crazy
So
in Canada. I'm not
I
as
mean, it
familiar with
still
Canada,
is.
but yeah, like you should check out that Peterson debate with Destiny. They go over all that pretty well.
So I want to ask you then, with that debate, Jordan Peterson and Destiny, is that another? Would you classify Jordan Peterson as wise? Do you see him as being a wise person?
It's a subjective statement, but yeah, I would say, yeah.
I would too. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's yeah. That. So I want to pivot really quickly, and I want to talk about film because I'm a screenwriter. You're a filmmaker, and I think what we've seen happen to film as an art form during the last 5 years, really, but maybe 10, has been quite cataclysmic for the art form itself, right? And I want to talk about why DEI as an ideology doesn't apply to art. It doesn't create great art. Um, I know that this is a very broad question, but you're a storyteller. And so I guess I want to start with asking you, why do you think storytelling is so important to human beings? Whether in written form or in film format, why do you think storytelling is important to us?
Because it's how we make sense of the world, right? So that's that's why religions structure their teachings through stories. That's why we watch movies and read books, and we have since the beginning of recorded time. Sat around fires
Mm-hmm.
and told stories. That's why archetypes resonate so much. And I think it plays a big role. I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I think it does play a big role in psychology and how we see ourselves through stories. So, is why is DEI affecting it? I mean, we could look at something like the Oscars, right? So we had these recent strikes with the Writers Guild and SAG, and the takeaway is it's pretty interesting because it is kind of comparable to the Don Lemon interview perspective on it. It's essentially just it all comes down to taking an end result and imposing that on the process. So the writer's strike comes out with the resolution that I don't remember exactly what the specifics are, but it was something along the lines of, okay, if you're writing a pilot, you have to have three, we'll just say, well, it's three or four, three writers from the union on payroll to write the first draft of your movie. Well, that to me, that goes against the free market and freedom, which is everything that I thought America stood for. Early on in film school, hearing the ideas that, oh, you're not allowed, if you're in SAG, Screen Actors Guild, you're not allowed to do certain projects. Wait a minute, I thought an American was able to live on free, like this is not a contractual, you're not working for a company here with an exclusive agreement. So
Yeah.
that was strange that to encounter that as a movie producer, you have to navigate these things. But anyways, the strike ends, they come out with this resolution. Okay, well now that's going to drive up costs if you have to hire this many writers, whether or not you need them. Because
Mm-hmm.
what's the point of a strike? It's for the people in the unions are trying to job preservation, and I can understand that motivation, right? Like, I mean, though this is another separation between wisdom, right? Because that is going to have ramifications on the creative process itself. As you drive up costs, that's going to cause studios to do more remakes and IP and bank on things they already have pre-existing intellectual property rather than doing smaller independent films like we used to do, because
Mm-hmm.
it's getting more difficult as costs go up. The threshold is now higher that they have to make their money back. We no longer have DVD sales. We have streaming now. So it's the gamble is bigger for them, and so the product that has it's a perfect example of how a competitive marketplace impacts the end result, the creative product, what comes out of it. When you
Mm-hmm.
start manually playing with that process and imposing things upon the process itself, it's going to affect the product that comes out of it.
Yeah.
So whether it's DEI and raising or lowering standards, it's very similar with the Oscars. To qualify for an Oscar, I don't know if it's every category, if it's just Best Picture, but you have to have a certain number of a racial makeup in either the crew off screen or the cast on screen. And there's even judgments on, does your story fit within a category of an underrepresented group? If so, it checks off a box. I mean, it's hard to make this up, but this is happening. And so now, yeah, that's a perfect example as well of taking, this is the result we want, go make it happen or you don't qualify. That
Yeah.
is exactly the thing that Don Lemon was arguing with Elon about. It's a different form of it, but it's the same in the terms of you're taking a specific outcome and forcing that upon the process itself. And the only way to do that is to do it manually by doing things like what we're saying, where you got to meet this or you're going to disqualify, or go in and actually change the standards. But
Yeah.
I
And,
don't know if
and
that
in
answers your
changing,
question.
no, you took it in exactly the direction I wanted to go, because it's very obvious that the standards in filmmaking have changed. And this is the part that perplexes me, because there are lots of amazing, Latino and Black filmmakers. I mean, film is an art that anybody, especially now, can partake in, right? If you have a camera on your phone, you can make a
Yeah,
film, right? Lots of people
exactly.
have done it.
That's another thing they're trying to contend with, is the democratization of all this. Hollywood used to run around the idea of gatekeepers. That's what an agent is. Because
Right.
Hollywood, the town, it was built upon gates kept by gatekeepers. That's why agents were so key and pivotal. You had to have an agent, and all an agent was someone who had keys to the doors, to the
Mm-hmm.
gatekeepers. They could get them on the phone. That's it. That's all an
Mm-hmm.
agent does, is sit in an office with his email and his phone and gets you through the
Yeah.
gates. And
And
so now we have that breaking down where you can't
yeah,
just
yeah,
talk.
the whole, of course. And I think it's beautiful. I mean, myself, I made a feature film uh for 3 years ago, during the pandemic. We did it on less than $10,000. We're now entering the festival circuit. I wrote it. It was filmed by a guy named Angel Alvarez. He's a director from the Dominican Republic. And ironically enough, the fact that I'm Métis, my mom is Plains Cree Indian, so I'm half Indian, and him being a Dominican director, as I mean, I don't like to use these advantages, but it's like it's people like, whoa, a Dominican director, let's wait. And it's like that shouldn't be why you're watching or interested in the film. And ironically enough, the film is actually about a young propagandist for the party in a not so distant future, who goes off into the woods and uses an experimental digital drug, and in the process is forced to face himself and all of the compromises that he's made to his own intelligence and wisdom and
Oh, that
ethics
sounds
over the
cool.
years. Yeah,
Neat.
I wrote it kind of as an analysis of culturally what was happening at the moment, right? And what would happen if, you took these people who were very ideologically committed, and if they were forced to face their true selves, and where that true self exists, right? Because, and I guess this is another conversation, but if you lie to yourself for so long, eventually you become the lie, right? You become disconnected from truth and reality. The lie is what becomes the core of who you are.
Mm.
And maybe that's what we're seeing reflected in a lot of people now, is that we've been lying to ourselves for so long that it's kind of created this chaos that we see around us, where, Warren Smith has very simple conversations where he critically thinks and kind of breaks away at the outer shell, and to find the truth at the center. But I think maybe that's why, and we could talk about this, that you've had a little bit of backlash, because people, I think, feel very threatened when somebody like yourself challenges that lie, and forces them to look within themselves, and find the real person that may or may not still be in there. So what has the backlash been like for you, and how have you dealt with it?
Yeah, the most backlash I saw, funny enough, it was just around the ContraPoints thing. I think there's
Right.
just a very noisy subset of for whatever reason, very motivated around that topic. So, because when the J.K. Rowling video thing happened, it was just a viral video, like we were saying. It's just luck. There was nothing for them to really get mad at. I didn't really have a presence anywhere. There was nothing for them to tweet at, really. I hadn't been using X for. I'd had an account, but I hadn't posted anything in 4 years. I'd forgotten the account was
Right.
there. And so,
Right.
anyway, so like I think it might have been a week or two after that. But then I was trying to figure out what am I going to do. And so the ContraPoints video, that's when I did start to see some backlash. But I just, by contending with it, I think they realized many. I mean, still, there's still people, but there was a wave, and they were just listing the college where I teach part time at one. You know, I teach full time at another one, but this one is public, and so they just were listing that over and over and over.
Right.
And but by contending with it and making a video about it, like it, I can't articulate them as well as they can articulate themselves. Like their actions are more revealing than anything I can describe.
Right.
I think they caught that. They realized that when they realized, oh, he'll just make a video about it and it'll probably backfire. There's just by objectively showing it. So then they they started to delete. Some of them deleted their accounts, funny enough, or probably blocked. I don't know, but I noticed the guy who was spearheading actually deleted his account. Someone said to me, which is interesting. But yeah, that was strange, man, because there was this one guy that was like, yeah, spearheading. And I covered up his name in the video, but I showed his tweet, and I didn't know much about X. And I didn't know to be careful about what you respond to. One day I was at school and I just saw a tweet from him saying, "Hey, would this be transphobic? Blah blah blah." And I was just like, "Dude, that's so stupid." I was just like, "Yeah, that would probably qualify." Just being like, "Go ahead." And then the Scottish Women's League, J.K. Rowling had just made a donation to them. They're a big entity in Scotland. I forget their exact name. They messaged me and said, "Hey, just so you know, this guy's been doing this for like 5 years with the same tweet. The person who made that comment has passed away 3 years ago. It was completely out of context. Here's the context around it. She was being harassed by these people and she was responding specifically to them. And now they've been trying to use that." And so I said, "Thank you for the context. That's very helpful." And I just deleted it. And then he kept that, then stuff started to heat up after that. And then I made the video and then they went away for the most part. And also I don't really pay attention to it anymore. So it's not, there might still be stuff going on with the YouTube channel, but I think we got through the most of it so that I'm not going to think about it either way. So I'm not that worried about it.
Right. And I guess, why do you think, because again, you're not a guy who's yelling into a camera, right? I understand why the people who, and there's a lot of them, the sensationalists and the people who, constantly veer off into hyperbole and embellishment elicit, the volatility that they do. But I get accused of being a Fed like every day. I get a DM, "You're a Fed." And I'm like, dude, I don't know. Feds need better set. Feds need better set design and production work if I'm a Fed. But why do you think bringing that critical thinking element elicits such volatility from some of these people? I mean, why do you think they react the way they do?
I asked them, I said, when they were tagging the college, I said, "Why are you doing this?" And they said, "Because the college deserves to know what their teacher is doing." And I said, "What am I doing?" And they didn't respond. So my guess is as good as yours. I think there's just something around, perhaps because ContraPoints was a big creator, I guess, content creator, has some followers. I don't know. But there's just something about that subset. Why are so many people the real question here is not about me. It's why are so many people attacking J.K. Rowling? That's crazy to me. That's the real question. So if I knew the answer to that, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so my hypothesis is that it's again much like, you could go back to Mao's China or the Soviet Union or pick whichever one. I mean, you could talk about fascist Italy, but that there's the ideology or the political and social tenets that make up whatever it is that they believe becomes a religious faith. And so when Warren Smith makes a video, maybe not in defense of, but kind of critically breaking down statements made by a J.K. Rowling figure, you are immediately seen as challenging the faith, right? And it goes to it. Yeah, there's a deeper philosophical question there, and like myself, I've been forced to face my own spiritual beliefs lately, right? And I always say I'm not a Christian, but I'm a follower of Christ. And it confuses a lot of people. And the way I explain it is that, if you read the four gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right, which is really all you really need to pay attention to in the New Testament. The rest is, funnily enough, I think it's in Acts. Jesus dies, he's resurrected, and then what's the first thing the apostles do? They create like a communal. To each according to their needs comes from Acts. Like, believe it or not, it's where Mark's pulled it from. And so when you read the Bible outside of the four gospels, you're just reading people's interpretations of Jesus's teachings, right? Specifically Paul, right? So I don't subscribe. I read it. There's a lot of beauty in it. Hebrews, in my opinion, is probably the most beautiful book in the New Testament, but you can take it with a grain of salt. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the gospels. And so that's what I follow. I'm a follower of Jesus in exactly what he said and the deep philosophical underpinnings of his message, right? Because he's a complicated person. He speaks often from the first person, but he also uses himself as a proxy for the reader or the listener, right? So Jesus alone in what he's saying, it takes a long time to really get it and grasp it, and a lot of thought and philosophizing over it. But I don't view myself as a Christian because I don't do the other stuff, the fluff, right?
I know what you mean.
And so, and so I think that what you're dealing with is a religious faith, and I think that's what this is. I think it's a religious faith, and the way that they behave is comparable to the Roman Catholic Church during the Crusades. And so Warren Smith says, hey guys, what you're doing is crazy. It's anathema to objective reality. And all of a sudden the mob comes after you and tries to destroy you because you're not challenging them. You're not challenging a specific subject. You're challenging an overall faith.
Yeah. The questions would be like, what is causing this emptiness, this void that is left to be filled by whatever, this thing that we're kind of characterizing as some form of, it's so, where is this devoid of meaning? Why is this occurring? Like, because I think that's what there's something, it goes back to the feeling good, feeling like you're, when you protest, it feels good, feels like you're standing up for something, or feels like you're fighting for something. So the lack of anything to stand for perhaps is leading to some of that. It'll be interesting to see. I haven't really looked yet about the comments around the DEI video, and to see, I doubt it seems to be a more analytical response. It's a bit less blind vitriol than the ContraPoints, that kind of subject matter. You start to get into more of just disagreement around, you could open up recruitment or whatever. Just people disagreeing on, I haven't looked yet, but I haven't seen anyone blatantly calling me racist or anything. So I don't, we'll see, but I don't, we'll see.
I don't see how anybody could pull that though, because you're not talking about the bell curve, for example, right? You're saying, and I think that this is a great example, just lowering your standards so that you can get that 20%, that 20 percentile in whatever way you have to achieve it. I mean, that's equity. And I think that's why equity is dangerous. But if you want to tackle that, how do we get that 20 percentile, that 20% without lowering our standards? Then you're going after a real problem. And that's where the real problem lies. Why don't we have 20%? Why aren't 20% of all doctors Black, for example?
Well, what percentage of the population is Black? I don't know off the top of my head. It's probably around,
right,
what is it, like 20%? So it's probably
something like that.
20% of doctors represent the population. I mean, it seems logical, but regardless, I'm not trying to make a statement on the statistics. I'm trying to make a statement on the process, not make a statement. I'm trying to analyze the process. But if the criticism would be something along the lines of what we're seeing, going back to Churchill on that first principle, and we can start wrapping up from here, but like that first principle, going back to that, where we're saying we don't judge people differently based on the color of their skin, right? That's a
Mhm.
line we've drawn. Well, now in this postmodern view, to go right back to the beginning of this conversation, now doing that is being called, oh, you're claiming color blindness. Well, if you're claiming that you can't see color and you judge everyone equally, you can't see racism, therefore you're a racist. There's something in there that we should look at logically.
I
In
think
order
what
to
it
do
boils
so, we
down
have to
to,
recognize our pursuit.
yeah, and I think what
Sorry,
it
go
boils
ahead.
down to is that, yeah, the proposed solution is the problem. That's where we've found ourselves, right? With anti-racism, the proposed solution is that race becomes the focal point of all of our interactions, and that is the nucleus of the problem itself, right? Is that if race becomes the focal point and what determines the way we interact with each other, therefore we are going back to the very essence of the problem, and that's where we'll
Yeah,
exist, you know.
yeah, I hope not.
So I hope not too. I want to ask you one final question, because this was
Yeah.
actually what I wanted to ask the entire time. So going back to film, the hero's journey, it's the most common story structure in film, in Western art, I'd say in art in general, right? In storytelling in general. And I think the reason why a lot of the films that we're seeing now have been so unsuccessful is because we've disassembled the hero's journey, in that we have injected DEI into our storytelling, and according to that uh, uh, way of molding and shaping a story, we can no longer tell the hero's journey in the way that it's been classically been told. Do you see the same thing? Do you see that I don't know what to call DEI itself, but that I guess the DEI itself. Do you see DEI as being something that has corroded or manipulated the way that we classically tell stories, and that's why the films that are being made or have been made recently by big major studios haven't been successful?
That's a good question. I mean, let's think about how could it affect the story process. Well, I think I don't think it's necessarily affecting how the stories are being written as much as it's affecting the casting. Because if we take, for example, the Oscars mandates, okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's one reason, that's one motivation to cast differently. Rings of Power, but then again, I'm contradicting. I shouldn't have said that before, because Rings of Power, they did write that in a specific way, where
Mm-hmm.
men in that opening scene with Galadriel, all the men seem to be incompetent, and it is to the point where it's a pattern that is detectable to the audience objectively. It just did. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's objectively, it was noticed by a large number of people. Therefore, it's not my opinion that it was noticeable. So, why is that? Okay, well, the student, well, in that case, why are they doing that? Perhaps they're the same reason that it feels good to protest, or it feels good to feel like you're fighting for something, or perhaps they're worried about how it will land with audiences. Because I mean, LA, Hollywood, that industry, it's a strange microcosm.
Mm-hmm.
It seems logical though that they would see that, oh, this failed all these last few times we've done it like this, we should correct course. And perhaps some of them are starting to do so. I mean, it feels like you hear a headline where, oh, Disney is canceling all the movies that are trying to do this, and but then nothing seems to change. You seem to see headlines like that every now and then. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
sure if they're really learning from it. The question is, why do they continue to do that? There's just social pressure, probably the same reason the universities are leaning into it, even though that it's affecting their bottom line. It seems like. I mean, will they change? I'm not sure, but the way that the only things that we can measure logically are the mandated things upon the process, which are, why would they cast these why are they specifically casting specific roles and sexes where they didn't
Mm-hmm.
used to do so? It used to just kind of organically come from what was best for the story. And now there seems to be more of an agenda, and I'm not quite sure why that is, but it's perception, how it's going to be perceived by the audience. But it's ironically, it's backfiring with the audience. I don't know. It's a very strange, complicated thing. I wish
Yeah,
it
and
was better.
no, because I have a screenplay that's currently in development, and the leads are two women of color, actually. And I wrote it that way just because that's the way,
Yeah.
exactly what you said. It felt right to write it that way. Right. And, but I've been wrestling with why it's obvious when gender roles or certain race roles are shoehorned into a film,
Yeah.
because you can feel it, right? Like,
Yeah.
you watch a movie and you're like, okay, this is done with a specific, like, there's a specific intent here. The characters weren't written this way. And I've been trying to wonder, like, how as a viewer you instinctually know it versus, because it shouldn't matter.
I could touch on that. Like when I talk about this when I'm teaching filmmaking classes, I talk in the writing process. It's if you're writing, and I think this is how archetypes come out in the hero's journey as well. Like so, J.K. Rowling, for example, I don't think she listed out archetypes, even though her stories are very archetypical.
No,
Like I think it comes from when you're writing privately for yourself. What do I want to see? And you're writing what resonates with you. It by definition will come out when done well, when done correctly, and you put enough development into it, and you do hit it in that pattern where, like, yes, this is the right pattern. You can feel it lock in. It's a very interesting subconscious. It's a puzzle. You're trying to get it to fit, and when it fits just right, you can feel it. And that's
right.
that thing that connects to archetypes. And that's that thing that's being broken that you're recognizing when you're like, that doesn't quite fit. It's not because it's being done for an alternative reason, which goes back to the beginning of the conversation. We were talking about why the reason is so important.
Yeah. Beautiful. I think that's a perfect place to end.
This was awesome.
Dude, Warren Smith, man. Oh, dude, thank you so much. I'm sorry I talked in circles a couple of times.
No, that was great.
You have such a way of presenting different ideas. So I'm trying to wrestle with these concepts that you're bringing up in real time. And, I'm a writer, man. It's so much easier. You know how it is. It's so much easier to sit down and write and kind of distill the ideas without having to articulate them in real time. So thanks for being patient.
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you, sir. Well,
stop it.
No, we're still going. So Warren,
Okay.
Yeah, Warren, go ahead. Tell everybody where they can find you, man.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. The YouTube channel, Warren Smith, Secret Scholar Society, and on X, WT Smith 17. I got to change that handle.
I don't know if you.
Is that possible?
I don't know if you can. You might not be Warren Smith anymore, but that's okay, because then in that case you could just become a bot and start harassing people like you've been harassed. So, and I've been thinking about like creating a fake account just so everybody that calls me a fed, I can go to their account like anonymously and go, "You're a fed."
You mean like a federal?
Oh yeah. I get accused all the time of being like a deep state like operative, which is strange because yeah, I don't know if you can hear, but I've had Little Mermaid going in the background the whole time because my kids are just on the other side of the wall watching a movie. So, but Warren, hang around for 10 seconds. We'll say our goodbyes privately,
absolutely.
but for now, dude, thank you so much for this conversation. I would love to have you back and go even deeper down the wormholes. That's awesome. Thank you so much, man.
Yeah, no problem. See you guys.